don't us three here kid ourselves that we're leaders on the left. We're not, we're marginals. We're just marginals. That's all we are. I know you get him on the telly now and again, Ashley, but we're still marginalised. We're not the big leaders of the pack, and we never will be, because we ask awkward questions and we ask them to do things, and we ask them to learn and to further their knowledge about important matters, and they just won't, because it's so easy to sort of shout fascist at everyone, or to become an activist and support some cultural group over the rights of one group over the rights of another. You got this terrible argument between the radical feminists and the trans supporters of them. It's just this is awful. This is completely nothing to do with the lives of the majority of the people living across the Western world.
I'm a professor of social science at Northumbria University. Man of the people.
Former professor of social science, a professor emeritus, whatever that means, and happily retired, man of the people, but I'm sure the people don't really care. So here I am.
Well, I wanted to talk to you mostly about the book, The Death of the Left. And I was wondering, how did you come to work together on this?
We go back a very long way. We started researching together in 1998, looking at what was then called the nighttime economy. And we looked at issues such as masculinity, violence, policing, and the state of play in consumer culture at the time. We started writing a lot about consumer culture. And shifted gradually into out-and-out political writing around about 2012, 2013, when we this is what we were from the beginning, but at the time we were earning a living as researchers and were researching specific issues. But all this underlying political frustration had been with us for a long time, because we're from the northeast of England, and we saw deindustrialization firsthand. We experienced that, our families experienced that. And we saw the decline of working class politics and working class representation in politics. I don't think there's a single horny-handed son of toil currently sitting on the front bench of the Labour Party, or perhaps anywhere on in the Labour Parliament, Labour side of the Parliament. So we saw all of this. So that politics was always then. We always wanted to write about it, and we started writing about it over 10 years ago. And we've suffered ever since from rather harsh critique, but we take it on the chin and carry on.
I think the other thing to say is that we would have preferred not to write this book, because we are long-standing leftists. For me, going back to my mid-teenage years, I've been a denizen of the left, and Steve has been more actively involved in left politics than I have. But we're committed to the left, and so often you go along with these things, and then direct where that old injunction that you should direct your critique at the right, all those kind of subtle ways of trying to curb critique of the left. And we kind of bit our lips for a very long time, especially in, when discussing the kind of more theoretical aspects of the left's failure. And, we didn't want to write this one. We knew we were going to get a lot of criticism, but for us to look at the current state of politics in the West, anyone invested in the well-being of ordinary people has to see what's happening out there in the real world as nothing short of a tragedy. Massive decline in living standards, increasingly disorganized inner cities. The built environment is breaking down. Our transport systems are in a disarray. Housing is a massive concern for even socially included working couples now looking to start a family, that kind of thing. So, these things require a kind of political investment. And now is the time for the left to become something else, because we're sick of the left losing and we wanted to win. We want the left to help these people and to create a better world for everybody. and we can't see any sign of that happening anytime soon. So we thought we'd, let the chips fall where they may and say our piece. And that was the real motivation for putting pen to paper on this book.
Was there an event, a breaking point that just made you think, I can't shut up anymore, I'm going to just take it on the chin?
Well, a number of them, I think. I mean, Simon can speak for himself, but for me, from quite a young age, I started to distrust the left quite early in the 1970s. I remember moving from a traditional working class background, mining village in County Durham, one of the country's largest coalfields at the time. And, I have to admit, I had some traditional views about family, looking after the children and families and making sure the next generation has some sort of security, all of that sort of stuff. And moving into the big city, I remember, because I was a musician at the time, moving into the big city and meeting the left was a horrifying experience for me, because I suddenly realized they hated me. And confronting people who you thought were, your allies, who were going to help you through a particularly rough period of economic history, where, we've had recession since 1973, since the OPEC oil shock. We've had mass unemployment after the neoliberals took office in 1979. And I thought, we need some allies. We need to sort of, I was very quite keen, but I had a lot of reservations about Tony Benn's plan for refurbishing the British economy at the time. I thought there were serious problems, but this is the sort of thing we need to be talking about. They weren't interested in any of that. They weren't interested in us. They weren't interested in our lives, in our communities, in our future, in our children. They were interested in their own personal interests, which a lot of it revolved around sexuality. A lot of it revolved around what I thought was quite sort of hedonistic lifestyles. They wanted to, it seemed to me entirely destructive. They wanted to destroy everything. And I started reading, a lot at the time. I wasn't an academic. I didn't become an academic until 1988. I started reading a lot at the time about the post-structuralist moves after the 1968 troubles in France, and how the left-wing politics shifted. And for me, I mean, that shift was a huge tectonic move. After 1968, when the old French Maoists and neo-Marxists, Pierre Victor and all the rest of them, moved out into the Renault factories and the farms, tried to persuade the workers to join in what they thought was a revolution, which is like a minor protest, really, a bit like Prigozhin's moving to Russia the other day. It was over before anyone really had time to analyze it properly. And they didn't like the French working class. They hated them. Drunken Catholics, traditional people who really should be consigned to the dustbin of history, to make way for our beautiful, brave new world, full of floating creatures who simply float off into space and do exactly what they want. And from that point onwards, I discovered that me, Simon, and the rest of the working class, I don't know if you still regard yourself in that group, Ashley, the rest of the working class at the time are no longer the agent of history. In fact, we're no longer welcome in the world. So that was a huge shock to me in the early 1980s. And I've been thinking about writing it ever since. But being a bit of a coward at the time, I kept my nose clean and nosed my way into academia by keeping a little bit quiet about all of that. And eventually we got the chance and the position to write about it when we came together. So we just, Simon said, let the chips fall with me, which went for it. We said, right, okay, this is our chance to get into the ring and really throw a few punches. So we did.
You said that they hated you, and you did mention the sort of French left and so on, but were there particular groups in the UK that you kind of had run-ins with? Was there a moment where you felt like a moment of realization that this was not for you?
Actors. The theatre groups. As a musician, you see, I was employed by these people, and well, particularly, well, of course, actors, if you look, from Sophocles onwards, actors were, have this ideological function of telling the rest of us what the future should be, and telling the rest of us how we're going to behave at some point. Behave now in order to forge a certain type of future. And just generally the urban left, which had sort of adopted post-structuralist ideas and was sort of living them out. And I was never one for weed, and cocaine and all of this. And I couldn't believe what they were throwing down their necks. I didn't, I was all right, the odd spliff, all musicians are occasional spliff. But what they were throwing down their necks and this is sort of chaotic lifestyles that they were celebrating was just a complete shock to me, And some of them were just so dirty. Their houses were so dirty. I couldn't believe it. Their flats were they never cleaned anything up, I remember a friend of mine who became, who also rejected the left, saying, "Well, I got rid of this girlfriend who was a Judith Butler sort of post-structuralist, and she left." And he said, "That's wonderful. It gave me a chance to clean the flat up, when she went, it was great." And I started living like a normal human being. And of course, the dirt bag left, which is now, which the I'm not au fait with all of these modern terms. I'm an old man, but I have heard of that, and that is just such anathema to ordinary people who tend to keep the houses clean and so they get the dog shit off the lawn in the garden so the kids can play on the slide and all of this sort of. The working people are very practical. The people I was brought up with. And you know what? Actually, I still love them. For all their flaws and all their faults. Yeah, they've got some prejudicial attitudes. Yeah, we need to change some ways of thinking. But I still love them, you see. And that's the difference between us and today's post-structuralist left.
From my perspective, we've kind of been marginalised within our academic disciplines because we've constantly pushed against conventional ideas, theories and what have you. And academic life, as you know, Ashley, has become increasingly clannish. And if you're not in the clan, then, you can be stigmatized and chastised and criticized simply because you aren't pronouncing the right ideas. You're not offering up the right theorists. And of course, we were dismissed as, class reductionists, kind of Marxist weirdos that just wanted to talk about economics and just wanted to talk about ordinary people and weren't interested in the increasingly central discussion of cultural stigmatization. And so, we neither of us, I guess, have been fully integrated into our disciplines throughout our academic careers. But the real tipping point is, for me at least, the reception of our last book, which was about right-wing nationalism and its connection to downwardly mobile ex-working class communities in the industrialized North. And I don't think we offered them any kind of sympathetic coverage whatsoever, but we were denounced by many of our disciplinary colleagues because it was suggested we'd given these people a platform to talk. And at that point, I think I just said, we're never going to get any support here from liberal social scientists. And so, we've kind of become a little bit more strident in our criticism of the academic liberal left in particular.
There's this idea generally that if you just sort of suppress ideas well enough, somehow, some way, the left will flourish and our ideas will take hold and there will be like peace and prosperity, not even prosperity, peace and safety in the world. I don't know if you see something different underlying that kind of impulse to attack the right, not give them a platform, minimize them, as opposed to having any kind of development on our side, but also debate.
Well, of course, it was Freud himself, wasn't he, who said that what is repressed will return. It will always return. And it will return in ways that you can't control. And we're seeing now the Alternative for Deutschland, just in the last couple of days, have got their first proper seat, haven't they? And we're seeing this rise of right-wing nationalism. I don't want to use the word populism because they use that as an invective. They use that as a scare term, and I don't find it too scary. Populism and democracy are pretty much the same sort of thing if you look at them clearly and with a little bit of detail historically. And so right-wing populism is rising and this is the form it's taking. And somehow they seem the liberal left seem to think that there's some muse of fascism out there, which is controlling people's thoughts and feelings, and it's ever-present historical, timeless muse of fascism. It's eternal, and it's going to get us, which sounds to me like paranoia. But what they don't do, what they'll never do, is look at their own role in destroying the left as a vehicle for working class representation and as something that can perform the sort of economic management that working class people need in order to rise and to give themselves a little bit of economic security, which they all crave. Our research is quite unequivocal about that. They want some economic security. They might want safety in every sort of type of activity they do. They don't want total safety and security, but they want economic security. You want to know that you can pay the mortgage at the end of the month and all the rest of it. And they're not in a position to give them that. So that the left's own guilt. And they won't look at themselves. They won't criticize themselves. They won't look at their own programs, their own concepts, their own history, and criticize themselves. I remember once Simon and I put on a conference at the University of York, and I made the mistake of criticizing what was then a left-wing star sociologist about the notion of moral panic. And I think it's a weak notion, because I think that the only people in a panic are the liberal left, because they think that the great unwashed are going to resort to grim authoritarianism because the tabloid newspapers tell them to, which to me is like it's a script from a Marvel Comics movie. It's just ridiculously simplistic. So the only people that panic, and always have been, are the liberal left. So I'd question this idea. I mean, just enraged, turn on me. How dare you question? Look, whose side are you on? We've worked all this out. We've been discussing this for years. How dare you question this? You're either on our side or you're on the other side. And I thought that was another moment, when I thought, well, this is a group of people who are incapable of reflexivity and self-critique and thinking about themselves and changing their ideas when they need to. So there you have it. It's we're up against something that is enclosed. It's an enclosed bubble, and they will censor anything that challenges that enclosed bubble, because they're so fragile that their whole worldview could fall to pieces if a few of those central concepts were removed.
I think the argument we make in the book is that the left has become non-dialectical, in the sense that idealism has triumphed, and any engagement with the material world, intellectual realism, philosophical realism, what have you, has just ceased to exist. And the left is increasingly concerned with its abstract ideals rather than everyday issues that really count to ordinary people. And so it's really not making a lot of headway. It's redundant. It's spinning its wheels because it can't draw enough people towards its discourse, because people are concerned with their material welfare. They're concerned about the things that affect their lives. They're less concerned with the kinds of abstract ideals which the left concerns itself with. The intellectualized left and some parts of the major parties, they've drifted off from the real world to occupy this kind of sphere of kind of abstract ideals. And I think that's just a terrible mistake. That left was always worldly.
Yeah.
It was concerned with worldly issues. It really socialism starts with a drive to change an unjust world, which was massively affecting the large part of the population, and that those kinds of ideals are, marginalized on the left. At least it's very difficult to get a hearing unless you accept the idealized discourse that is, at the center of the left today.
Absolutely. I mean, we're often accused of being nostalgic social democrats, wanting to return to the New Deal era and, the Attlee-Bevan era of mixed market economy, nationalisation of industries, which is completely untrue. But what we want to do is return the ability of a left capable of economic management to have a few triumphs now and again. Because if you don't have a few triumphs now and again, people lose faith entirely. You have to be able to have some impact on the world, some incremental impact on the world. What the left did, the only successful time we've had in this country is between 1945 and 1951. I wish people would stop talking about the 1960s. Nothing happened in the 1960s politically, nothing at all. It was just this silly American countercultural revolution that got us absolutely nowhere and actually helped to open the door for neoliberalism. But that period, and we did serious things: nationalisation of industry, health service, state and related pensions, democratic representation. Now that was nowhere near perfect. We don't want to go back to that. We want to go forward to something better than it. But that was a better platform. It was so successful that the Tory government they got in 1951 because people were sick of austerity and the Tories promised to make everyone richer as usual and tell a pack of lies. But the Tory government were forced to continue those policies. There was nothing they could do to get rid of them. They had to keep them. And, my family were miners and they waxed lyrical about the better conditions in the nationalised industries. They could breathe underground. They weren't dying. Yeah, they were getting good pay. They were sinking huge ventilation shafts and they had steel pit props instead of wooden ones that cracked and let the roof down on them. You know what I mean? And everything was getting incrementally better. Now, nowhere near where we want to go, and I'm sure nowhere near where you want to go. But we don't want to return to that to stay there. We want to return to that platform because it was a platform on which we could have a few triumphs. The working people would say, okay, this lot are pretty good. Let's stick with them and let's keep going. But no, that's not good enough. We have to have these ludicrous, ridiculous visions of a beautiful future full of floating people. And if we don't, enthusiastically commit ourselves to that, then we need to be thrown in the dustbin.
So you mentioned how these ideals, abstract ideals that are just, you use the words like, well, Simon, you say abstract ideals, but you've, Steve said it's like floating people. But surely there are some ideals that people do care about and that matter. So for instance, freedom is an abstract ideal that seems to have a lot of purchase on the part of working people. So are there just the wrong sorts of ideals? Can you give a few examples?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned freedom. I think this is also a colleague of ours has suggested that we needed to pay closer attention to freedom, and obviously we reject the suggestion that we don't deal with it adequately. I think very often on the left's account of freedom is as hollow and meaningless as the account of freedom offered by the neoliberal right. Freedom has to take the individual somewhere. If we're flogging freedom to ordinary people, there has to be an endpoint. It's a vehicle to another destination. We're free to do something in order to do something else. We are given freedoms to achieve a thing, an outcome that is valuable, useful. In many cases, the predominant form of freedom that the left has advocated has been as negativistic as the kind of neoliberal right. We're going to take something away, something we don't like. So you might say, well, an account of freedom might be the removal of free market capitalism, and freedom is the result. But you have to tell a story about what that result would look like and how it would affect lives and why people should want it. You have to establish a system that you're attempting to bring to fruition, rather than just throw. People say freedom, and I immediately want them to write a book about what they're talking about to take the discussion forward, because unless you're going to pin it down and say precisely what your freedom is and what it's enabling people to do, then it's just one of those phrases that people bandy around that doesn't really have any substantial meaning. So, I think I'm all for freedom, but freedom in order to do valuable, socially useful things that enable people's life experience to improve. And I think in many cases, what, if we've done a lot of research, a lot of social research, especially in the north of England, and what people want isn't freedom. What they want, on that spectrum there is security. They're far more interested in achieving a degree of security, which will act as a platform for better things.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think also, of course, that abstract ideals are timeless and they're context-free. Platonic ideas, freedom, justice, democracy. I mean, George Bush was very good on his fame and democracy. Yeah, I kind of get fame and democracy. What did he mean? Well, for George, in this context of highly competitive neoliberal capitalism, I think, as R.H. Tawney once said, freedom for the minnow is also freedom for the pike. It's freedom for the monopolist. It's freedom for the I don't want to go talking about bankers because I'm accused of being conspiracy theorist again, but freedom for people to simply acquire massive property rights and lord it over the rest of us. I think Bill Gates, what's the percentage of American farmland that Gates is currently bought up?
Bill Gates has been snatching up 242,000 acres of farmland across the U.S., enough to make him the top private farmland owner in America. According to the Land Report, the tech billionaire has been purchasing agricultural land for years, building a massive portfolio of farmland in 18 states. His largest holdings are more than 69,000 acres in Louisiana, almost 48,000 acres in Arkansas, and about 20,500 acres in Nebraska. Additionally, he has a stake in 25,750 acres of traditional land in Phoenix, Arizona, which is being developed as a new suburb. It's not clear how Gates' farmland is being used.
This is all about control versus freedom. It's good versus evil. It is a spiritual battle.
This is freedom. This is a result of freedom in this context. We all want freedom from the dull compulsions of capitalism, an old Marxist notion of freedom, the dream of the old man where you fish in the afternoon.
The German Ideology by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Page 53. And finally, the division of labor offers us the first example of the fact that, as long as man remains a naturally evolved society, that is, as long as a cleavage exists between the particular and the common interest, as long, therefore, as activity is not voluntary, but naturally divided, man's own deed becomes an alien power opposed to him, which enslaves him instead of being controlled by him. For as soon as the division of labor comes into being, each man has a particular, exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. Whereas in communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production, and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic.
And I still agree with a lot of that. I'm not dismissing. Don't get me wrong. The idea of the falling rate of profit is still a very powerful idea. The labour theory of money doesn't fly, so we have to be selective about what we take. But this idea of freedom is a timeless, abstract, context-free. It's ahistorical, and we need to know what Steinman says, what freedom means to us now. What sort of freedom? Where do we start? What sort of freedoms do we start with? How can we build up an itinerary of freedoms that will move us closer to whatever the abstract ideal is? What is the abstract ideal, actually? Let's ask you a question. What is that? What is this dream of freedom? What is it for you?
Well, the odd thing is that I actually have a much more negative, I think of it as a much more negative view of freedom, in that I am suspicious of when people always need to fill these abstract ideals with content. So obviously my first book was about happiness, which happiness was a floating signifier, right? A vague reference toward something good, right?
Yeah.
And then people come and they start trying to fill it with content, because I argued there's a fear that people will get it wrong and they'll do the wrong thing. And so it has to be stipulated in advance. So this makes me kind of suspicious of anyone who wants to say, well, hold on a second, what does freedom really mean? We don't mean like freedom to smoke, right? We don't mean freedom to just do whatever you want willy-nilly. That's dangerous. That's risky, right? So I think some of the I don't know, suspicion of these grand ideals is a suspicion of people's ability to live in them, and to live in them in a negative kind of way, to pursue them in whatever way they feel they want, which is how I read that line from the German ideology that you mentioned.
I fish in the afternoon. I'm pretty sure you fish. You do your work in the morning, so you're not entirely free.
That's right. The realm of necessity will always be with us. Right? But it won't,
So
but it won't dictate who we are.
You're on half shift. That's fine. Half shift's better than nothing.
Yeah.
You're on half shift, then you go fish in the afternoon, then you philosophize in the evening. So he was being prescriptive. I mean, people.
Well, yeah, without having to be any of these things. The idea was that it would no longer determine your existence. That
so that's the negative idea of freedom put forward by right-wing liberals such as Isaiah Berlin, who could distinguish between positive and negative freedom. The problem with that is, and I don't disagree with you, that we should leave people a space. It was John Stuart Mill's space, wasn't it? This sort of boundary. He put a boundary around it, but no one knew what the boundary was or where it was. That it should be established by the rule of law, because, of course, he was can't remember an act utilitarian or a rule. He was a rule utilitarian who established this boundary by the rule of law, and then the spaces in it to do what anyone wants. That's great. The negative aspect of freedom that you're proposing should not be ignored, and I totally agree with it. But what are the boundaries? And what do some people do different things with that freedom? Like Tawny said, the pike does different things with that freedom than the minnow does. So what can the minnow do to prevent the pike's outcomes of his freedom? This seems like a constant battle. There's a constant battle going on in that space of negative freedom. And I really don't know who's going to win it. It seems as though the people we don't want to win are doing very well at the moment. And the monopolists and the property acquirers. It's a very good book by, I think it's, my old brain, but I think it's Brett Christopher, called Asset Management Society, where the whole of the world, including Ukraine after the war, because Larry Fink's over there already with Zelensky talking about how they're going to carve up the Ukrainian farmland and Monsanto and BlackRock. How do we stop these outcomes of freedom? How do we do anything about that without interfering with the system that promotes that sort of freedom? That's my question. And I haven't got a ready answer for that. But if we don't address that, I think that the idea of negative freedom, which goes back well before Berlin. I mean, Berlin never had an original idea in his life. It goes back towards Socrates. If we don't do something, if we don't make it clear about what that freedom means for people, and then we proclaim a free society, and then nasty things happen, then we're going to tarnish the name of freedom simply by our neglect. And that's what I worry about. I worry that entirely, promoting negative freedom might backfire.
You've got to have a space for freedom, but especially in democratic context, it's a difficult sell. We're going to bring freedom. We're running on a freedom ticket. It's, you must admit, Ashley, that these are fairly hollow sounding promises to people who are, seeing a massive historic decline in their material standards of living. So I think it's just to add some substance there, add some clarity, so that we can actually begin to talk about how we can positively affect the lives of ordinary people.
Well, I tend to think economic security isn't valued in and of itself, but for the freedom that it gives, right? So I remember that when I had no money, still don't have a lot of money, but like really, really no money, nothing, like everything was so difficult. Every single thing was fucking difficult. Like it was so frustrating because you couldn't do anything. You're just utterly trapped. And economic security gives you all these freedoms. That's why people desire it, right?
Right.
So, and I think that's part of what's contained in that word. When people talk about how they want freedom, they mean like they don't want to have to keep working for the man or whatever. They don't want to have to, so I think that's kind of bound up in it. And of course, when I say like freedom is an empty signifier, or when you say that freedom is an empty signifier, of course it is within the context of capitalism, right? Because it's not empty. It appears empty, but it's not. So when I say freedom, you might be thinking, yes, my security to do what I want and go on holiday and not have to work for the man if I don't want to. But when someone says it, what they really mean is my freedom to, I don't know, exploit without any limitation, my freedom solely in the sphere of buying and selling, and not your freedom to dictate what happens in economics. No. Your freedom to vote every 4 years. It's always stipulated in advance. And of course, when I think of negative freedom, I mean removing these barriers that mean that you're free to sell your labor to whatever capitalist will buy it. You're not free to not do that, right? Like you will truly be free to, as far as the realm of necessity allows, that is, you will always have to work a certain amount just to reproduce our existence, but to be free to do whatever you want after that without it dictating who you are and what you become and what you do every day, 9 to 5 or 5 to 2 in the morning, whatever it might be in your precarious existence.
Sure. But I mean,
I would go for the philosophical. Sorry, I was just going to say I'd go for the philosophical tangent and suggest that labour is actually integral to Western subjectivities at the moment. I think in terms of happiness and contentment, when we put our energies to a cause, that's when we are working at our the peak of human existence. And I think the problems arise when the left offers accounts of liberty that just involve the absence of all commitments and obligations and forms of labour. The absence of these things just suggest ennui, we're sitting around in luxury, just slowly decaying, and nothing really counts, nothing really matters, as long as we're free to determine what we eat, what drugs we take, what we do with our time. And I think especially now that labour should be integral, not freedom, but labour should be integral to a new account of forward moving left. We build things, we do things, we apply our efforts, and we do it communally together to a common purpose. Because there's so much labour, and have a gripe about UBI and things like that. There's so much that needs to be done. People need labour. We in Britain at the moment need a huge amount of labour. If I look at my window, everything seems to be decaying. We need ordinary people to be involved in these processes, and I think this is one strategy that could allow the left to succeed and kind of reconnect with working class voters.
Yes, and I think the modern monetary theorists don't suggest rather than UBI a job guarantee program, that anyone wants to have a job and contribute to communal well-being should have a job at the average national wage. And that would give people the security to do all of the other things they want to in their free time. It wouldn't be an onerous job. It would be a normal working week. And trade unions lobbied for decades to get our weekends and to finish at 4 or 5 o'clock. And of course. And this works. So that's another way. There's a dispute between those who believe in UBI and those who suggest a job guarantee. But these are the sort of practical steps that we're talking about that the left could take to say, well, look, the balance of the freedom Ashley's talking about, the negative freedom, which we're not dismissing at all, and the sort of positive security that actually gives that negative freedom some meaning, that you need something, you need to stand on a platform. I mean, you can be free and walk off a cliff. You've never been more free in your life, but you're going to fall down and break your body. And it's to look at freedom in that pure abstract way, I think makes people nervous, and it makes them think that things are going to fall apart and they're going to fall down and hurt themselves. So we have to be very careful when we're trying to sell negative freedom. If it's not couched in some sort of on some sort of positive platform, then, and this was the argument in the 1950s, and this was the argument. I think I'm being a little unkind to Isaiah Berlin, because he did talk about the relationship between positive and negative freedom in a more sophisticated way. But of course, he came down on the side of negative freedom. because they wanted the fledgling neoliberals in the 1950s wanted to get rid of the government control that had been establishing itself since the New Deal and the British Labour Party, and throughout Europe. I mean, I remember people like Willy Brandt, and this was a fairly firm government control over a mixed market economy, and it tended to sort of work. And it wasn't perfect. It melded positive and negative freedom together reasonably sort of well. There were still old cultural traditions and prejudices and bigotry that we needed to get rid of. But during that period, if you look at the 1970s, for instance, the Race Relations Act and the decriminalisation of homosexuality, that was a better context in which to start the process of getting rid of that bigotry. Now, of course, what we have are culture wars. We don't have any solidarity. We don't have any unified approach to these issues. We simply have culture wars, which are incredibly destructive. People falling out, and you know what Twitter's like and on social media. It's horrific, and there's no chance of any solidarity when you're enmeshed in a post-structuralist culture war. The conspiracy theorist in me is not entirely in control of my consciousness. I must hasten to add this. Would say that that the intelligence services promoted post-structuralism after 1971. They don't pull strings. We're not just dupes, but they actually, through the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, funded research into post-structuralism and identity politics because it was a nice way of leaving class and economy behind. But I don't want to go too far because you get yourself back the worst name you already have. But I think it's true that post-structuralism and their idea of untrammeled negative freedom was very good for neoliberalism, and the Pikes came through the door, and they started to amass their monopoly property rights. And the huge property rights they have now. I mean, I've just resigned from my dentist. I'm not paying you £15 a month because it's going to an asset manager in a company, in an equity company in London, and lining the pockets, which is based in Dallas, Texas. So the equity company, I'm giving money to people taking out of the country and going to Dallas, Texas. I'm not doing it anymore. So I signed up with the NHS again. And this web of monopoly ownership of property and acquisition and equity is something that is a product of this total negative freedom in the context of a competitive market society. And so we have to be just a little bit circumspect about it.
Yeah, I mean, you can have like freedom within the markets, right? Only in a context in which everything else is narrowly circumscribed. Like that's
impossible. When everything else is impossible. That's the answer about it. Yeah, you have to play the market, otherwise you don't survive. Yeah. And
for the post-structuralists, this is something that Foucault argues as well. He's a bit ambivalent about whether or not this is a good or a bad thing, but the market was this sort of like, externally fragile, if internally robust kind of system that needed careful management on the outside. So paradoxically, in order for this freedom to reign, we can't really have any freedom. Like you can't have freedom to dictate or vote on anything that really matters in life. This is all just technocratic stuff that people who know better will deal with. And you can, maybe we'll have a debate about gender, maybe we'll have a debate about culture and bigotry and so on, but you keep your hands off the economy and keep your hands off this and don't do that. And for your own safety, the realm of freedom gets smaller and smaller. It's more what I'm trying to get at.
Absolutely. And this goes back to the French physiocrats and the early classical liberals. It's not just something the neoliberals invented, the separation of the economy from all political and cultural life. Just let it go. The physiocrats invented the term laissez-faire. Let the economy move along under its own logic and its own dynamics, and just leave it alone, and that will benefit everyone. Well, that's of course it's total nonsense. It has to be bailed out every time with quantitative easing, every 10 years or so. It's just total rubbish. And we wouldn't believe this sort of stuff, that this is the ultimate, leave this thing free. And this is another negative free. This is the ultimate negative freedom, isn't it? Laissez-faire. Let the economy work. Let this clockwork thing work underneath us and benefit us all It was Mandeville's fable of the bees, wasn't it? It was, what was it? Private vice shall be turned into public virtue, he said. All right. Oh, thanks, Bernard. Thanks for that one. And it's, of course, complete rubbish. I mean, philosophers do talk largely rubbish, you know, and that's another issue that we have. They're free to do that, of course, but we're also free to ignore most of what the philosophers say and pick out the good bits. So we're in this position where we have the outcomes of negative freedom in, as you say, the logic of a competitive capitalist company. And that's where we are. And we have no one else to blame but ourselves for landing ourselves in this position. Peter Turkin, I don't know if you've read Ensigns, talks about a counter elite, which tends to take over the left, becomes the left mouthpiece, and you know he goes back a very long time, right across the world. The Taiping Revolution, rebellion in China, the French Revolution. But working people have never really been represented by the left, not properly. It was only after the Second World War when we did actually get a few working-class representatives through both in the USA and in Europe, through to the parliamentary systems, that things started to change a little bit in our direction. And then 79, 80, that was all thrown out, and here we are.
Well, you've kind of anticipated my next question, which is that. So you're talking about the death of the left. Now, I was going to say which left has died, but when your book initially came out and I wrote an endorsement for it and you had posted sort of on Twitter, one of the criticisms that came up was, calling again the death of the left. Can we just stop doing this? So what do you say to that kind of criticism? You know, right wing now is a slur. You know, to be called right wing is something that people don't want. No, I'm not a right winger. And any kind of criticism is sort of couched in this careful kind of language. So can we really say that in what ways can we say that the left is dead? And are we not just doing this too much, declaring the death of things?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think from our perspective, we've worked very hard to keep the idea of the left alive. And we've said things are fine when actually they're not fine. And they're said we're moving forward when actually we're regressing. I think we've moved away from the lives, certainly in Britain, where the places I know best, we've retreated from the lives of ordinary people. We feel the left is disconnected from the issues that really matter to ordinary people. We're electorally insignificant unless you're going to throw in the mainstream neoliberals, Starmer's Labour Party and whatever else. We're having very little effect upon the world. We've had increasingly, less and less effect upon the world these last few decades. And, it's easy for us, we're concerned with abstract matters. I'm sure we all read a lot. We're concerned with theoretically what the left should be and where it might go. But in the ordinary world, the real world, we have virtually no impact upon the fundamentals that shape everyday life. And I think the declaration, that the left is dead, is simply an acknowledgement of the fact that it's no longer moving forward productively. As I said, the kind of idealism has taken over and replaced any concern with material issues, with real world issues. But I can't see anything productive happening that will take the left back to the real world and have it affect the lives of ordinary people. But I mean, to address your point again from a different direction, I guess my point is that what our book does is we're charting that story of disintegration. We're charting, here is the left. It started off, it was full of vigor. It wanted to do good things. It was successful in some respects. It began to move forward, and then all kinds of internal problems arise, and it moves off track, forgets its founding commitments, and gradually dies. It comes to an end. In our conception of what the left should be, dies. But we hope that it can be reborn. It's not dead and it's never coming back. Death opens up the opportunity for a rebirth. And I think this is the point. This is the fundamental point we want to get to in the book, is